and Congressman Joe Kennedy. Broadcasting across the Commonwealth in partnership with WCAI and New England Public Media. Live from our Brighton studios, here are our moderators, Jim Braude and Margery Eagan.
Good evening and welcome to our audience here at WGBH and those watching at home to the first debate in a Senate race that's being closely watched not just here, but all across the country.
With an incumbent who served in both the House and the Senate, a challenger with 7 years under his belt in the House, tonight is the first night you'll get the opportunity to weigh their differences and their worldviews. As for the rules, there are no rules. No opening statements, no closings, no time limits, although we will be keeping track of speaking time to keep things relatively even. And we want to cover a lot of ground, so brevity is appreciated. Feel free to talk to each other as well. In fact, we encourage it, gentlemen. And since we're asking our studio audience not to applaud during the debate, we'd like to take a minute right now to give Senator Ed Markey and Congressman Joe Kennedy a hand. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Margery, it is all yours.
Congressman Kennedy, some of Senator Markey's supporters have criticized you as an opportunist in this race. So why are you running to defeat a man who's championed so many of the same policies that you support?
So, Jim, Margery, thank you for having us tonight, Senator. Always a pleasure to be with you. Thanks you for the audience, to everybody being here, and for those tuning in around the country. Look, for this election, this time around, so much of what we care about, everything that we care about, is on the line. And what is at stake for us, for our party, our Commonwealth, and our country, this one counts. And for this moment, we have to make sure that you have a United States Senator that is giving everything you possibly have to make sure that you guide our party and our Commonwealth through it. And look, that means that at this moment, Massachusetts, this is not a swing state, and this is not a swing seat. There is a special opportunity and obligation that comes with it. Because voting the right way and filing the right bill, Mitch McConnell doesn't care. This is about making sure that, one, you are a constant presence in Massachusetts, making sure that the people across our state know that you're fighting for them and know what to care about. Two, that the folks victimized most by this president, those that are vulnerable, those that are suffering, those that are immigrants, those that are different, know that they've got a champion there for you every single day. And three, that given the challenges that we face, that you have to ensure that you're bringing everything you possibly can to restore power to a Democratic Party so that we can actually advance the causes we care about and protect the people we care about.
Has he been a good senator?
Absolutely, he's been a good senator. But Jim, this isn't about whether or not Senator Markey's made an important contribution. Of course he has. But the issue is, at this moment, given what is at stake, with the headlines that we saw ripped out of today with his President Trump's pardons, what he's done for weaponizing ICE, this is not about filing the right bill and voting the right way. We have to do everything you can to restore power to a Democratic Party across the entire country, flip the House, flip the Senate, flip the presidency, and restore the courts. And that, I think, is a type of leadership that I can bring to the seat, and I think that's what Massachusetts deserves.
Got to hold you. We're going to return to most of those things. Some of the critics of your candidacy, Senator, they note that you've been in Congress more than 40 years. In fact, you first served before he was born, as I'm sure you know. Bipartisanship in the Senate is dead. The Democratic agenda is going absolutely nowhere. Some believe that a fresh face with a different approach is exactly what's needed to change the dynamic. Why are they wrong, Senator?
Well, again, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Margery. Thank you to WGBH. Thank you to your great audience, especially the young people over your shoulder. This whole debate should be about the future, their futures. And that's what I fight for every single day, the future for these young people. When I introduced the Green New Deal with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just 1 year ago, it transformed the way in which climate change is being debated in the United States and across the planet. It made a huge difference. And it's based on laws I've already passed. The fuel economy standards that we live under, that's my law in 2007. The appliance efficiency standards, that's my law. That reduces the amount of oil that the Koch brothers can sell. That's the coal industry desperate. On guns, I passed legislation to just in December to have $25 million be spent by the Centers for Disease Control to begin the research on the causes of gun violence in our society, built on a law that I passed earlier that bans 10 million Chinese assault weapons from coming to the streets of the United States. And I might add, in December, again, just 7 weeks ago, my law passed $350 million more dollars to find the cure for Alzheimer's before 2025. Listen to this number. It's unbelievable. 15 million baby boomers will have Alzheimer's if we don't find the cure. So on the big issues of today, the challenges of today, I've not only been leading, but I've been delivering with legislation which passes, which protects the people of Massachusetts and the whole country.
Do you remember the part where I mentioned brevity, gentlemen? Let's remember that. Do you want to respond to what the senator had to say there, Congressman?
Look, I think, as I said before, Jim, the senator has made an important contribution to our Commonwealth and our country. The fact remains, though, that on a number of the challenges that we confront today, many of us just last week celebrated Valentine's Day. This Valentine's Day was the 2-year anniversary of the shooting in Parkland. Right? The fact remains that we have not, Congress has not, the federal government has not passed meaningful gun violence legislation in decades. When it comes to the environment, we have not. Senator Markey's been a leader on this, and he has been. But the last transformative law that was signed into, the bill that was signed into law to transform the way the federal government protects the environment was signed by Richard Nixon with the Clean Air Act. The bottom line is that when it comes to the moments of today, the challenges that we confront, with Mitch McConnell saying, look, what this is about maintenance and access to power, and he is going to hold on to it with everything you got. You got to go with those structures.
Can I interrupt? Honestly, that's just not accurate. The last meaningful gun safety legislation passed in the last week of December of 2019, when my bill was actually signed by Donald Trump to begin research at the CDC that had been blocked for 25 years by the NRA. My bill makes NRAs stand for not relevant anymore in American politics when you can have a victory like that. And I might say, the last environmental law, the big one, well, that was my law as well. It was the 2007 law that doubled the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive. 70% of all oil goes into gasoline tanks. It's the single largest reduction in greenhouse gases of any law ever passed in any country in the world. So I've been leading and delivering fossil fuel industry. I beat them. The gun lobby, I beat them just in December. Beat them. The law is on the books.
We're going to get to all these things in a minute.
One thing about the Green New Deal, though, as you know, many of your Democratic colleagues, including Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, House Speaker, she doesn't think that there's a chance that the Green New Deal can pass. But there's no carbon tax in the Green New Deal, and that's something that a lot of businesses and some of your GOP establishment leaders have supported. So why not put that in there and maybe have an increased chance that this can get through in a bipartisan way?
Look, the Green New Deal, since we introduced it, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I, just 1 year ago, it's transformed the debate on this issue. We deal with the fact that our own scientists say the planet, Massachusetts, can warm by 8 to 10 degrees over the next 80 years, and that our sea rise would go up 10 feet for Massachusetts. So the magnitude of the problem is clear. And what we say is we have to solve this problem with millions of new jobs that are created, and to do it with justice. So the frontline communities, the minority communities, that we do it with intersectionality. So that's what the bill does. And what we have to make sure is, no matter what we do, that it doesn't lead to dramatic price increases for the poorest in our society. We have to have a debate over how to get this done. But we have to be absolutely non-negotiable when it comes to the targets that we set. So we can accomplish this goal. There are many different pathways we can take in order to accomplish this goal. We just have to say that we're going to transform our society into 100% clean energy. And we can do it with a number of different pathways, including fuel economy standards, appliance efficiency standards.
You said recently, Congressman, I would put meaning you would put up your environmental record against anybody. Please do.
Great. So, look, big picture to small. This is an issue that is important to me. I am 39 years old. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. My goal as a parent is to make sure that they've got a planet that is going to be there for them, the same planet that I was able to inherit from my parents. And the fact is that while I believe the senator is right, that there are now plenty of different policy ideas out there to try to address a warming climate, that what we lack is, in fact, the political will to get there. I support the Green New Deal. I think it does frames the debate the right way. Carbon neutral emissions, getting us down to net zero emissions, a sector by sector decarbonization. The approach that I've taken to it is trying to ensure that communities that have borne the brunt of environmental degradation and climate change are put in the forefront, like communities like Fall River. And specifically, if you look at what I've done in communities like Fall River, it's we filed a bill last week to make sure that communities that are being targeted for petrochemical plants and chemical contamination, that they've got a greater ability to push back against it. We've been working with the community in Fall River there to transform that economy to be the staging area for offshore wind. We've filed legislation and worked on that with Senator Markey. We've been dedicated to issues like combined sewage overflow and stormwater runoff,
So
the ways in which this impacts local frontline communities and gateway cities.
If I may, both of you have been supportive of those who are opposing the siting of the natural gas compressor in Weymouth. But one of the things I don't quite understand, you've taken money from BlackRock, which is a major investor in that compressor. You have nearly, according to Nation magazine, close to $2 million in your portfolio of stocks in fossil fuels. Does that not at least leave the appearance of some sort of conflict, even if you say it's not going to affect? Why don't you divest of those stocks, and why don't you return that contribution, starting with you, Senator, quickly, if you would?
Look, I went down to Weymouth and stood with those citizens. And I told them, and the citizens of Braintree and Quincy, it's a small piece of land where a natural gas company wants to, like a straw, bring up natural gas. That compressor station should not be there, so that they can ultimately move it up to Maine to export that oil, that natural gas, most likely to China. So what I've done is I've led on that issue, and I'll tell you why.
Why are you taking money from an investor, though, in the project?
Look, I vote my convictions. And from my perspective, what I've done is I've taken on that company that wants to go to Weymouth, and I've told them absolutely not. And I've led the effort on that issue as well. Absolutely guaranteed that there's no dispute, which I'm not going to be the leader on. And I'll tell you why I lead on it. I lead on it because when I was a boy and I was in Malden, my mother told me not to swim in the Malden River because of the chemical companies and the coal companies that were polluting the Malden River. And she said to me, it would be unsafe to swim. So wherever I see these environmental justice issues, I stand up and I fight for those communities. I've done so for Weymouth. I've taken on that company. I've told them absolutely under no circumstances, right from the beginning, that it should not happen.
Why don't you divest of those stock holdings, Congressman?
Jim, there is not a single vote that anybody can point to that shows that investment holdings that have been long held have influenced my vote once. You look at my record of taking on fossil fuel companies, it is as strong as anyone is in Congress. And the idea that those holdings have influenced my vote at all, you can't find it. Go ahead.
One last thing about campaign finance, and then we'll return to the order that we were intending, if we can. The congressman has challenged you repeatedly, Senator, to support a people's pledge originated by, as you know, Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown years ago, virtually the same people's pledge that you embraced in 2013 and 2014. If it was good enough for your races then, why is it not good enough for this race in 2020?
Well, I've introduced a progressive people's pledge for 2020 so that we deal with the era of Donald Trump. Yeah, we should have a pledge that keeps out dark money, that keeps out negative voices. But we should welcome positive voices. We should welcome disclosed contributions so that environmentalists, women's groups, labor groups, LGBTQ groups can speak. We're in Massachusetts. It's 2020. Donald Trump is president. We need to have a new, modern people's pledge, not an old one for the Trump era.
What's the matter
that
with that?
allows for positive voices to speak.
What's the matter with that, Congressman?
That is an exception that swallows the rule. Look, what we have asked is it was good enough for Senator Markey back in 2013. It was good enough in 2014 when he championed it, when Massachusetts set the standard for keeping dark money out. It's the same pledge now. You start making people adding in voices that we like. Who gets to decide which voices those are? Who gets to say our voices that we like or voices that we don't? Dark money, Jim, is dark money. Massachusetts walks the walk when it comes to progressive values. We need to do it now. And you open the door to this, you open the door to an absolute landslide of money coming in to distort the electoral framework that we have been so proud to be able to keep
Very
out.
quickly, who does decide what is positive and progressive and what's not? I mean, who makes that decision?
We need the voices to be positive, and we need
Who
the
decides
sources.
that?
Well, You will decide. You will decide. The media will decide. We should have positive voices.
After an ad's
we should
already
have.
cut-
We
One
should
second,
have.
and then let's- you said the media will decide. Go ahead.
And no dark money. If it's not disclosed, it should not be allowed into our state. So it should be disclosed.
How
And
about
why wouldn't we want environmental
How about it,
groups?
Congressman?
So after an ad is already cut, the media is going to come in and say it's not. So Fox News can say it is, but WGBH can say it's not. There is no rationale to this whatsoever. Jim, the broader point on this, look, campaign finance reform is one of the core issues for a Democrat and for progressive values to try to make sure that you level the playing field so that you can, in fact, empower the people that are hurting today across our country. You do not do this. How are you ever going to pass a Green New Deal if you allow the fossil fuel industry to open up the spigot and flood the airwaves with scare tactics? That's what this is about.
We should not silence these progressive groups. We should encourage them. We should celebrate their desire in the era of Donald Trump in the White House, trying to destroy every one of our values. If they want to come into this debate, speak positively, disclose their funding sources, we should welcome and celebrate it, but keep out the dark money and keep out the negative voices.
15
that should be
seconds,
the
then we have to
pledge
move on.
for
The
2020.
Koch brothers just invested in a race across this country with positive voices in a positive way. The Koch brothers, the #1 opponent of environmental protection, environmental regulation in the country, they can craft things in a positive way. That's what the senator is advocating for. There's no way this works. None.
We got to move on.
Yeah, let's talk about a couple of current issues, starting with immigration. You both condemned the decision by Customs and Border Patrol to come into Boston. But what do you propose to do to stop them? We'll start with you, Congressman.
So, a couple points on this. One, the way in which this administration has gone about targeting and vilifying an immigrant community is one of the most abhorrent things that I have seen, certainly over the course of my time in office, and I think the senator would agree. We have to ensure that we continue to speak up and push back. Massachusetts has a proud history of immigration. Our country has a proud history of immigration. My own family, both sides of it, is an immigrant family, and I'm very proud of that. What we need to do is ensure that we are as not just elected officials, but as members of our community, standing up, speaking out, rejecting the Trump administration's efforts. But more than that, building to a place where we actually can, in fact, pass comprehensive immigration reform. The first Father's Day with my son, I spent on the border outside of Tornillo, Texas, protesting the family separation policy as this administration ripped children from their parents' arms. There's no way that is ever the answer for immigration. That is what this administration is going to do. That is what they're going to continue to do, to scare, to vilify, to tear this country apart. And it means that you have to go at this with everything you've got. And that's the type of leadership I hope to bring to the Senate.
Senator?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is just part of the Donald Trump policy of trying to make America great again by making America hate again. These SWAT teams that will come in are just meant to terrorize immigrants. He has tried to take Muslims and Mexicans, immigrants, women of color, and demonize them. You know, when I announced for the Senate 6 years ago, I went up to Lawrence, to 88 Phillip Street, where my father grew up, to knock on the door, where the 5 Markey brothers and sisters grew up. See who lives there now. And out on the porch came a Dominican family. And the accents were different, but the aspirations clearly the same for that family as for the Markey family. What Donald Trump is trying to do is to terrorize those families in Boston, to make them afraid to answer the door, to be afraid that the parents might be separated from the children, to make it much less likely that they will cooperate with law enforcement officials. I agree with Marty Walsh, the mayor of Boston. I agree with Rachel Rollins, the district attorney of Suffolk County. I agree with them. We have to make Boston a beacon on the hill. We have to make it stand for the freedom which it always has stood for. And we have to fight Donald Trump every single step of the way, take him to court, not cooperate. This is fundamentally a challenge to who we are as Bostonians.
But there's no way to stop them right now.
We have to take them to court. We have to stop them in court. We have to introduce legislation so that we debate it on the floor of the House and Senate, try to move it as far as we can, as fast as we can, to let him know that he's accountable. I'll tell you what I did back in August. When Trump announced he was going to take kids who were in hospitals in Massachusetts and deport them, even though they had cancer, I stood up and I fought him, along with Congresswoman Presley. And in 2 weeks, we got Trump to back down. You can't deport kids with cancer. I won just in August on that issue. We have to do the same thing. That's who we are here in Massachusetts.
Speaking of kids, if I may, both of you, as you know, in terror, 700,000 DACA recipients in this country, young people brought to this country by their families or by others. The Supreme Court will decide in relatively short order what the disposition of them is to be. Maybe 3 years ago, Democratic leaders in the Senate went to the White House and said, we'll give you all $25 billion for your wall, President Trump, if in return we get protection for the Dreamers. Two quick questions, gentlemen. One, would you support the same deal, meaning giving him all his money for the wall? And two, if you wouldn't, what would you be willing to trade for the President and the Republicans to protect the Dreamers? Quickly.
Great. Here's what I would trade. I would trade presidents. Let's just get rid of Trump. He's out of here, okay? We have 8 months to just get rid of this guy, to get rid of Mitch McConnell running the United States Senate. That's what this next 8 months is about. It's about a referendum on this issue, about who we are as a country. He goes right to the soul of who we are. That's what the president is doing. And it's our responsibility to make sure that this man is merely a footnote in history.
Would you give him money for his wall, though, Senator?
No.
Democrats are willing to do that in January 2017.
I am not willing. We need a pathway for all 11 million immigrants in our country. We need to make sure that the Dreamers are made citizens. We have to protect the temporarily protected status citizens, residents who are here from Haiti and other countries. We have to do that. And by the way, I've also introduced legislation, the GRACE Act, to lift up to 95,000 a year the number of refugees we accept in our country. The president's only accepting 13,000 this year. This is an absolute disgrace. So on each and every one of these issues, we've just got to get rid of Donald Trump, change the whole agenda for our country, and put out the welcome mat to immigrants, which is what has made America great. You cannot make America great by putting people down. You make America great by lifting people up.
Before we get rid of, or you get rid of Donald Trump, what do you do for the Dreamers there, Congressman?
Jim, I went back and forth between Republican leadership and our leadership a year ago. When the House, we had the votes to pass an additional piece of legislation to protect Dreamers, TPS recipients, and deported veterans. And I've got some pretty strong relationships with Republicans, and some folks came to me and said, hey, can you negotiate, can you transfer a message there to House leadership, which I did. And every time the response was the same. We hear this from the president all the time. And then by the time we make it from the Capitol to the White House, he changes his mind. You cannot negotiate with a ghost. You cannot, you are anticipating that the president says, this is the deal, take it or leave it. Every time we engage in those conversations, he changes his mind. Every time. And so we can get into hypotheticals as to what it would take. I went through those conversations relaying, not negotiating, but relaying those messages. And every time, when it came back to the Republicans to say, get that, have that come from the president, they balked because they know that they can never actually pin him down.
Can we move to another current event if we can? There's, as you both know, a recent possible breakthrough agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban. It could mean the beginning of the end of the longest war in American history. This 7-day so-called reduction of violence could inaugurate a drawdown from 13 to 8,000 American troops there. Starting with you, Congressman, should the president stop at 8,000, or should all U.S. troops be out of Afghanistan, or should we leave a multi-thousand counterterrorism force there for the foreseeable future? Which is the preferred route?
We need to bring our troops home. We have been at
all of
war,
them?
as many of them as we possibly can to ensure the safety of our country. And look, let's be clear about this. We have the ability to deploy rapidly should we need to. The president still maintains broad constitutional authority to protect our nation and our interests. But let's be clear. One, we have been at war in Afghanistan for the longest armed conflict in American history. Two, we still have, according to an extraordinary investigation done by the Washington Post that came out on the Afghanistan papers, we still have no clear idea, after 20 years, what our mission is, what success looks like, how long it's going to take, or the burden we're putting our men and women in uniform or their families. And so how long are we going to ask soldiers and our armed forces to go deploy overseas
Well, that's what I'm asking you. Do we bring them all
you
home?
bring them home.
All
you bring
home.
them home
All.
as fast as we possibly can.
Not even a small number there to protect what we've gained. I mean, we've talked about that. Small number, not everybody, but a very small number.
You know, when I visit Afghanistan, I can see the incredible tension still on the streets of that country. And from my perspective, I think that it is absolutely imperative that we remove troops, that we try to resolve this issue, negotiate a resolution of it. The Taliban, the U.S. government, the Afghan government, Pakistan, they're all going to have to be involved if this is going to work, if we are going to protect this country from descending into chaos, which it did the last time the Taliban had any kind of power in that country. It still has power in large parts of it, but to completely remove the United States immediately, it could jeopardize 50% of their population. Women in that country were living in terror when the Taliban had total control. We cannot allow that to happen again. So we should draw down as many of the troops as we can, test any agreement to make sure that the protections which are put in place are working. But until we're sure that that is the case, we could in fact jeopardize, once again, the lives of 50% of that population who will descend once again back into medieval conditions, which is how the Taliban was treating that population in that country. So draw down the troops, do it as much as you can while you're guaranteeing that any agreement is in fact working.
Congressman, the senator has a long history in foreign policy areas. Anything you would have done differently than what he's done,
So,
vote-wise?
so yes, with response to this question first, though. The recent attack where service members in Afghanistan were killed was a green on blue attack, killed by our allies. I visited troops in Walter Reed who were injured for the rest of their lives by our allies. Yes, we need to make sure that we are protecting innocent civilians in Afghanistan, but we've been doing that for 20 years at grave cost. And look, we are in the longest conflict in our nation's history. That was a war in Afghanistan after 2001. In 2002, we went to war with Iraq. And we are in Iraq today, still. That authorization for the use of military force in Iraq was used to justify the elimination of General Soleimani, an Iranian general, off of a completely separate, from a separate nation, off of that had nothing to do with Iraq's quest for weapons of mass destruction and completely separate rationale for going to war. Yet that authorization was used to do so and keeps us in the Middle East even today.
That authorization, by the way, was used by President Obama to do drone strikes in Yemen that killed 21 kids. You didn't call for an elimination.
Absolutely.
You did at that time?
Absolutely. Jim, look at the record. I have been outspoken about about repealing the authorization for the use of military force from 2001 and 2002 for years. And
how about his record, though? He's got much more experience in foreign policy.
And he voted for the Iraq War. And he voted for it. Without a sunset provision to say at a certain point you got to come back and justify it, without a definition of success, without a question as to what burden we're going to put on our men and women in uniform. And that authorization is being used 20 years later. I met recently with a bunch of returned veterans. I heard from them as they talked about their mission overseas or in the Middle East, and one of them said, "That's interesting hearing your mission. That was my mission 5 years before." We still have no clarity as to what we're doing. And that is the result of that vote.
When you voted for Iraq, you were in a minority of Democrats in the House of Representatives that authorized action in Iraq. Do you regret that vote, Senator?
George Bush lied, Donald Rumsfeld lied, Dick Cheney lied to the American people about the presence of nuclear weapons in Iraq. It was a false pretense to start a war. I'm still angry about that lie to the American people. I regret that vote. It was a mistake. That's why every day I work to make sure that Donald Trump cannot start a war on a false pretense with Iran. That's why I lead with my legislation to make sure that Donald Trump cannot start a nuclear war with North Korea without prior authorization of the House and Senate. That's why I lead on the new miniaturized nuclear weapons that Donald Trump wants to deploy massively, which makes it more likely that we will actually have a fightable, winnable nuclear war in the mind of Donald Trump. And it's why the major peace groups, Peace Now, Mass Peace Action, Council for a Livable World, have all endorsed me. The peace groups have endorsed me. They've had a chance to look at both of our records, and they have endorsed me in this race because I am fighting Donald Trump and his reckless military policy every single day. We are just a tweet away at 5:30 in the morning of getting into a military conflict that will be catastrophic for our country and for the planet.
Senator, before we go back to Congressman Kennedy, though, Senator, as long as we're on foreign policy, you voted present for the use of force in Syria around the chemical weapons matter. Why did you do that?
Very simply, there was a rush to judgment. There was an attempt to have a vote that was forced without complete information being given to the committee. And so I protested that we weren't being given the information. And I said, I'm waiting until I get everything I need to know whether or not we should be bombing Syria. We should be bombing Assad for 60 days. And when I got all the information, I understood the consequences. I announced that I was going to vote no, that I would not give the authorization before that vote came to the Senate floor. So I made sure that I was not going to be put in a position where there would be a rush to judgment.
By the way, our producers just tell us you've had about 2 minutes more time, so we'll give a little extra to you, Congressman. But you want to respond to what the senator said.
The lesson of Iraq, one of many, is that you do not go into another Middle Eastern country without knowing how you get out. And when confronted with that question, roughly 10 years after that vote, the senator voted present. Not no, not yes, on a matter of war and peace, but present. And I think that record speaks for itself.
Look at
30 seconds.
Look at when your government does not give you all the information you need, and one senator says, "I'm going to demand that all the other senators get the information they need." That was just in the committee. Before we bring it out onto the Senate floor, let's understand what the consequences are if we bomb in Syria, put our young men and women at risk. So I led the effort to get the information. And by the way, they then withdrew that resolution. So it was the disinfectant of all of that information, which then made it impossible for them to get the votes on the Senate floor.
The present vote is not a disinfectant for the reason as to why.
Let him finish, please. Let him finish, please, Senator.
A present vote. It's hard for me to understand when a present vote is going to be a profiling.
15 seconds, Senator.
When you're hiding facts, when you're lying without giving all the information to the American people, then somebody has to stand up, which is what I did in order to ensure that on that issue we would not be pulled into another conflict in the Middle East.
Why not vote no, as the Congressman just suggested?
Because I wanted to give them the opportunity to present all of the intelligence. They had not done so. There wasn't going to be a vote on the Senate floor for another week. So I was demanding that our information be put out in the public so it could be understood by the other senators and by the American people.
We got to move on. A 2017 exploration of racism in Boston found that, by the Boston Globe Spotlight team, found that Black Americans rated Boston the least welcoming of 8 major American cities. The wealth disparity figures put the wealth of white Bostonians at $250,000 and only $8 for Black Bostonians. Nationally, the number is much less smaller, and for Latinos, the wealth disparity is more than 100 to 1 here, and it's 8 to 1 nationally. So what specifically have you done, would you do, we'll start with you, Congressman, to change the situation for people of color here in Boston?
So, a number of things. Margery, one, the statistics that you cite indicate a terrible legacy from our Commonwealth and the federal government at racial discrimination that persists to this day. And the fact is that the disparity in those numbers, $247,000 for median net worth for a white household in Greater Boston, $8 for an African American household, and $0 for a Dominican household. That is the result of intentional choices made by government, federal, state, and local, and is not going to be resolved without intentional choices made by government, federal, state, and local try to address it. One, housing. The biggest reflection of that is the fact that after 10 years of economic growth, a segment of our population wasn't able to access a housing market. So you have to be deliberate and intentional about making sure the federal government's going to make a sizable investment and access to affordable housing, particularly in communities that have been redlined and directly affected by housing policy. Look at the legacy of FHA, the GI Bill, the ways in which the federal government has systemically and systematically, over years, prejudiced African Americans and minorities. 2, zoning laws. You have to make sure that you clear up those zoning laws that end up being a prohibition about the ways in which people can actually build housing stock and actually accumulate wealth. 3, the issues around transportation. If you're trying to look at ways you can actually get to work, to get home, to care for a child, the 111 bus in Chelsea takes you an hour to go 3 miles. African Americans spend 60 plus hours more per year on a bus than white Americans, than white people do in Boston to get to work. 60 hours a year more just to get to work. These are the results of deliberate discrimination that have to be addressed, and the federal government can do an awful lot about it, and we need to.
Tell us a couple things the federal government should be doing, Senator.
Well, I've introduced legislation with Elizabeth Warren to construct 3 million affordable homes in our country. That will reduce the overall price of homes by about 10% if we do that. To introduce a bill of $75 billion to increase the number of public housing units in our country so that it's there, it's affordable, and it's modern. That we have free college tuition, that we have free community college tuition for people of color, for low-income citizens in our country, and that ultimately we change our transportation system. My father, when he drove a truck for the Hood Milk Company, just used to go up to the Fellsway, get on the bus, go into Sullivan Station, then go over to the Hood Milk Company to drive the truck. Well, that's how people live today. When transportation systems don't work, when the T doesn't work, when we don't have the bus lines that go out into the communities which need it, then we have a big problem. I lived it in my own house. My father got up to get on that bus every single day. So we have to make sure that we provide that kind of programs. And moreover, so much of this just goes back to the original sin in our society, slavery. You know, that's why it's so important that we have a debate on reparations.
Well, by the way, on
that
that
we
note,
have a debate on how we've treated minorities in our country, especially those who are descended from slaves. They have a legacy of mistreatment that then manifests itself in imprisonment, lack of programs to help them to be able to achieve, and discriminations that's still deeply built into our society. And if we don't deal with that reparations issue, if we don't deal with the massive incarceration of African American and other minorities in our society, and then the aftermath of that, which then results in these kinds of income and wealth disparities, then we're not going to get to the core of this issue.
You know, I just wondered, you obviously are federal legislators, but there's been a local push here to return to some form of rent control, which would limit the amount of raises, increases that landlords could throw at tenants. What do you think of that?
I think, Margery, literally anywhere I go across the state, housing, cost of housing, and access to housing is the #1 issue. Whether that's out in Pittsfield, to Springfield, to Worcester, to Boston, or any place in between. And so we have to do an awful lot more to make sure that housing is in fact affordable. Look, I spent, as you both know, I spent a couple of years as a legal aid volunteer in the housing courts in Boston, trying to keep people in their homes in Dorchester and Roxbury and Mattapan in the midst of a foreclosure crisis. You see the impact every day of a system that actually has fairly robust tenant protections, but the challenge that if people don't know about them or have access to them.
So should we go back to rent control?
So I think rent stabilization certainly needs to be on the table, and there's a wide variety of measures that we can address. The rent control can be part of that debate. I do think that if you're looking for the statewide and systemic reforms that are necessary, investments in housing, and affordable housing, and reforms to our infrastructure and public transit to make sure that there's more housing that is affordable as well. And then the last piece, briefly, you have to address the other economic challenges that we have here in Boston. Healthcare costs, cost of childcare. It costs more to raise a child from birth to 5 than to send that kid to college at Boston University.
We want to talk about health
year after year.
Rent control, yes or no there, Senator?
I would support any community that wants to impose rent control. If they believe
local option.
Yeah, local option. If they believe that in their community that the housing costs have just spiraled so far out of control that it's leading to an exodus of the poorest and the most vulnerable out of that community should have a right to impose rent control in order to stabilize that community. We're seeing a gentrification that is taking place across our state, but it's across the country as well. We just have to deal with this as the epidemic which it is, because housing, education, transportation, and breaking down of the discriminatory barriers that exist are actually at the heart of this issue. We have to make sure that we're giving these opportunities to every family, but especially those who are black and brown. I grew up white. I know that there are much higher barriers to black and, excuse me?
Still are. I just want to be clear.
Yeah, and I'm very conscious of it, and I'm very conscious of the discriminatory barriers that I did not have to deal with.
Let's move on to healthcare.
Yeah, let's move on to healthcare. You know, we have one of the lowest uninsured rates in the country here in Massachusetts, but you both, I believe you are both supporting of Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. So does that mean you support getting rid of the private insurance that 160 million Americans have through their bosses, their employers, including those people in unions that have negotiated these great health benefits in their contracts? Let's start with you.
Look, we still have a healthcare crisis in America. We're running a sick care system, not a healthcare system. 30 million Americans do not have health insurance as we sit here tonight on Channel 2. Healthcare bills are still the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the United States. We spend twice as much money in the United States as other industrialized nations, and we have the 40th worst outcome for health. So we're paying twice as much and we're not getting the answer. So that's why we need no deductibles, no prescription bills. Why we need to ensure that we transform the system so that everyone gets the health care which they need.
Eliminate private insurance?
And we have to move towards a pathway in our society. We have to debate it. We have to do it correctly. We have to do it in a way that causes the least disruption. But we have to move towards that system. That's a system that will keep costs low.
But eliminating private insurance.
Over time, we have to move in that direction. And the reason we have to move in that direction...
I got to hold you only because the time is way out of whack, if I may. My apologies. You can take a little extra time. Congressman, get rid of private insurance?
So let's start big and we'll get there. First off, the healthcare system for the richest, most powerful nation on earth should be able to ensure that every single person gets access to the care that they need. And the fact is that today, even in our country and even in our state, we don't. A couple of statistics for you. 17 million insured patients in this country, still ration access to medication. 26% of patients that depend on insulin ration their insulin. $88 billion, the amount of medical debt last year alone. $812 billion, the amount of healthcare dollars that go to administrative costs and not a dime of which actually makes you healthier. $252 billion. The investment that is made from our dollars into insurance companies that don't actually get turned back around into your care. So and the kicker, $12,000, that's the average amount that every American family spends for healthcare already today. Premiums, deductibles, copays, out-of-pocket costs, $12,000 already. So, look, do I think we can do better? Absolutely. My uncle introduced a single-payer bill on the floor of the United States Senate in 1971. And when you look at that speech, some of the factors that he looked at, maternal mortality, infant mortality, life expectancy, almost 50 years ago. And yes, between 1971 and today, those stats have gotten better. When you look at them compared to other OECD countries, we've actually gotten worse. When you adjust them for race and income, you fall through the floor. Do I think that 50 more years of iterative process is going to ensure that, look, I will get access to great health care? That single mom in Mattapan? Probably not. And I think 50 years is long enough to say that the iterative process that we have taken is leaving far too many folks behind.
But Medicare for all it scares some people because they do like their insurance, despite these problems with it. And,
yes.
And a lot of union people love their insurance because they get great deals. So would you favor taking that away?
So two things. One, this debate has ended up in this odd litmus test of whether you would allow private insurance or not. The entire point of the bill is that people are going to get access to better health care at lower cost. I think we can do that. And let's try to actually do that. Two, there's no single-payer system in the world that has wholly abolished private insurance. But you know what? It is a source of inequity. It is reflective of some of those statistics I cited. And we better try to make sure that people do, in fact, get access to the care that they need.
But we have to be, I have to just be clear, because you're both supporting Medicare for all, and other than the Buttigiegs of the world that say Medicare for all who want it, you're not saying that. You do or you do not support the essential elimination of private insurance over time. You said yes over time. What's your answer to that, Congressman?
I think we need to make sure we provide access to care that we need, and I think we can try to do that without access to private insurance.
Without access, yes. Quickly.
Well, look, we have a healthcare system that needs to be fixed. My mother contracted Alzheimer's. She was going to become senior class president. My grandmother died. My mother had to be the caregiver for the family growing up in Malden. My father, the milkman, he married my mother. When she contracted Alzheimer's, my father said, you know, Eddie, it was an honor that your mother married me. She was a brilliant woman. You've got to help me to keep her in the living room here in Malden at 7 Townsend Street. And you know, the right arm of the milkman is the strongest arm in the world, lifting 6 milk bottles all day long. And so at age 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90, we kept her in the living room in Malden. Well, 15 million baby boomers are going to have Alzheimer's. Medicare and Medicaid bills will be equal to the defense budget. It will bust the entire healthcare system in our country. That's why I've led on the effort to fully fund research to find the cure for Alzheimer's by the year 2025. That's my legislation. That's the law in our country. We must find a cure by 2025. And if we don't, that issue alone will bankrupt the system. So we have to look ahead, lead the way. That's my legislation, which is on the books right now, and it's up to $2.8 billion just this year in funding to find the cure. I was able to add $350 million more in December to accomplish that goal. We have to give hope to every family that they have Alzheimer's solution that is on the way. Otherwise, almost every baby boomer family will know someone with that disease.
Let's talk about the president.
Yeah, let's talk about the president for a minute, your favorite person here. The 25th Amendment determines what to do if a president is deemed either physically or mentally unfit to serve. This became an issue early in the president's term when then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein talked about getting some cabinet members together to remove the president. And then there were the 27 psychiatrists and psychologists who wrote this book talking about the president's malignant narcissism that they thought these medical professionals made him unfit to serve. Senator Markey, do you think that the president is mentally unfit to serve?
First of all, there's not a chance in the world that the president's cabinet is going to remove him. And sad to say that there are tens of millions of Americans who agree with the president on everything he does. I just saw that on the Senate floor. I sat there for 2 weeks. I heard overwhelming evidence that he had committed a high crime against the country. I looked over at the Republican side. There was irrefutable evidence that he had done so. And then we cast the vote. I stood twice and voted guilty to each one of the counts. And the Republicans, they acquitted him. So to the extent to which we think that Donald Trump is wrong for the country, look, in the United States Senate, in his cabinet, he has willing, supine allies.
But do you think he's mentally unfit?
I think he has crazy ideas. I think his view of the world is absolutely a rearview mirror view of the world for a country that never existed. But I don't think anyone, and my wife is a psychiatrist, can evaluate anyone at a distance without examining them. So I can't come to that conclusion except to say his ideas are crazy.
And by the way, you know that a colleague of yours, Jamie Raskin from Maryland, actually has a bill together to compose a body, authorize the composition of a body who would be able to make these kinds of determinations under the 25th Amendment. Do you think he's mentally fit for office, Congressman Kennedy?
I don't think, one, I'm not a doctor, and I don't think I'm qualified to make that determination. I'll leave that to the professionals. What I will say is that his actions alone disqualify him from office because the Mueller report, if you read it, is a clear indication of the fact that he actually obstructed justice on multiple occasions. And look, as you know, I was a prosecutor. I had cases where people didn't have any evidence or witnesses. They were called pleas. That's what that should have been. And that's essentially what that was. So the part here that I think is critical to understand, the bigger picture, is that this president violates his oath of office to protect every single citizen in this country literally on a daily basis. But what is incumbent for every single one of us now is to ensure that you are doing everything you possibly can. We ended up in those impeachment proceedings with the oversight through the House of Representatives because we were able to flip the House. We need to ensure that we are doing everything we can if Republicans are not going to abide by their oaths as impartial jurors, then you go out there, you hold them to it, and you flip the Senate.
Okay, so speaking of both, we have very little time, so we need really quick answers. A lot of people, Democrats think that, and a lot of others think, Attorney General Barr has violated his oath of office. A woman you're both supporting for president says if he doesn't voluntarily resign, like 2,000 Department of Justice members, former members say he should.
Is the only way we can deal with a man who responds to a tweet from the President of the United States and changes the sentence?
So the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think the Justice Department is in crisis.
We're going to stay in the judicial system. Obviously, you know that there have been 2 justices appointed, very conservative. Supreme Court, obviously a tilt to the right. The 2 are the oldest justices are liberals, so the president could potentially affect the tilt for a generation or beyond. There are some presidential candidates who proposed limits might need a constitutional amendment. Enlarging the size of the court, as you know, could be done by a statute.
And I think term limits are the better way to go.
Do you support enlarging the size of the court, Senator?
I think we need a debate on changing the Supreme Court. Term limits, enlarging it. It's time for us to do so. Although I will say this, I'm glad that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not term limited in the last 3 years of the Trump administration. Does not get reelected and have the next Democratic president, after she's sworn in, name all the justices in 2021, 22, 23, 24. And that should be our principal near-term goal, to make sure that he's out, that we control the Senate, and that we can confirm the justices of the next president of the United States, who will be a Democrat.
We only have a few minutes left, gentlemen, so quick answers, please.
You both support some relief for student debt, and
every single the commitment that our country has made to every generation is that you get a pathway to an education that gets you to a good quality job for free. And the reality of the circumstances at the moment, we don't. So the appropriate pathway that I believe in is that we should eliminate student debt for 95% of all students. For families of means. I don't think that your taxpayer dollars
drive an ice cream truck to earn my tuition. Without federal student loans, I couldn't have gone to college. So I identify with all these kids that have a backpack of debt that they have to take out of the college that they graduate from. So I do believe we should make it debt-free. I do believe that we should have free community college, free public universities in Massachusetts.
For everybody, or means test?
But I would limit it. I don't think rich people should be us. That it becomes a way in which it changes the whole direction of an individual's life. And I know that because I lived it. Without those loans, I could not have made it. I was paying back my student loans in my 3rd term in Congress. That's how dependent I was upon that program.
We're out of time. Last question, and this time is going to be time and force. Let's end where we began. After having been informed by an hour of debate here, could you sum up, starting with you, Senator, for voters, how you would describe the differences between the two of you? 45 seconds. Why you should be rehired, I want you to say.
I am, once again, given the opportunity to serve in our state. I will lead on a Green New Deal and get it passed in the next Congress. I will lead on the strongest possible gun legislation that can pass and make it the law of our land. I will lead and win legislation that fully funds finding the cure for Alzheimer's so that this plague is stopped before 15 million baby boomers have it. I will lead on those issues. I've already been successful in passing legislation in those areas, and I will continue this effort to ensure.
Senator, thank you. Congressman.
Thanks for having us tonight. And thanks for this opportunity to engage. Look, we are at a moment of crisis for our country, for our Democratic Party, and for our Commonwealth, for so many of the issues that we believe in. And yes, filing the right legislation and voting the right way is a critical part of this job. But if there's one lesson from today's Washington, D.C., it's that this is all about power. And if you are serious, it comes with a Massachusetts Senate seat to go out there and rebuild the bench to deliver on the structural change that is necessary, ending the filibuster, ending the Electoral College.
10 seconds.
Campaign finance reform, keeping dark money out so that we can actually deliver on the ideals of a Green New Deal, of college, of the Voting Rights Act, and getting and ending gerrymandering. This is all of the parts that we need to address.
Thank you, gentlemen. We want to thank you both. It's all the time we have for tonight. Thanks for watching and listening. Thanks again to the candidates, Senator Ed Markey.
Thank you so much.
Primary election day is September 1st.
Don't forget to make your voice heard on that day. He's Jim Braude. I am Margery Eagan, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good night.
This has been a production.
Woodruff on the NewsHour tonight.
Weeknights at 6 on WGBH2.
Jimmy Kimmel,
I videotape my relatives. I keep all the family photos.
Marissa Tomei,
I love my particular family's heritage, our traditions.
and John Turturro.
With my family, nothing surprises me.
Finding Your Roots.
Next on WGBH.